Welcome to the Oxford Martin School for this evening talk. Thank you very much to be here. I'm Jean-Charles Buffet. I'm the research manager for the school here. I'm delighted to have Professor John Drake here today. He's a visiting fellow for both the Pandemic Science Institute and the Oxford Martin School. John will speak for around 40-45 minutes and will be chaired by Dr. Luca Ferretti. We will talk about globalization, global change, and emerging infectious disease. This is a live stream event, so think about it if you want to ask any question at the end. If you're online on Crowdcast, please use the Q&A button. But please, Luca.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. So it's a pleasure to invite John. John has been here since the beginning of this year, visiting both the Oxford Martin School and the Pandemic Science Institute. He's the Regents Professor of Ecology at the University of Georgia, and he has been working a lot on the interplay between ecology and evolution and epidemiology of infectious diseases. That makes today's talk really, really interesting. So John, it's all yours. It's a pleasure to have you, and looking forward to this talk.
So, good evening, everyone. When we begin today, I want to think about this scene. Emerging infectious diseases are not random shocks to human societies. This here is the Matsamo border control checkpoint near Jeeps Reef in Eswatini. Eswatini is a small landlocked kingdom in southern Africa, bordered by South Africa and Mozambique. Its 1.2 million residents live in towns and villages spread across mountains, forests, and agricultural lowlands. Despite its compact size, the country feels spacious, shaped by steep highlands and long horizons. I crossed into Eswatini at Matsamo on March 6, 2020, returning from a conference in Kruger National Park. A colleague and I had made this detour through the Ho-Ho region. The border post was quiet. A long roof for lorries, red-painted offices, and a few travelers, like me, were waiting in the heat. When my turn came, a nurse lifted a non-contact thermometer to my forehead, and she wrote my name, in pencil, in a small ledger. It was an earnest and improvised gesture of vigilance at the moment when global air traffic was just days from collapse. I asked myself realistically, what protection was that notebook going to provide? But for me, the scene captured something essential. It was a meeting between local resolve and a world already bound by dense mobility. The thermometer, the pencil, and the ledger were more than tools. I think they're a metaphor for the limits of localized responses in an era when pathogens move through global systems. And that tension between the intimate and the planetary runs through this talk. Even as the machinery of global life hums along, trade routes, supply chains, tourism, scientific collaboration, it rests on an infrastructure of hidden interdependence. By the early 21st century, ecological degradation, rapid land use change, urban concentration, and dense mobility had altered the geometry of risk. The world still appeared resilient, but it was a resilience that was optimized for efficiency, not buffering. To me, as an ecologist, this pattern is familiar. Highly connected systems can function smoothly for long periods, yet be vulnerable to sudden shifts. When coupling becomes tight in ecosystems, finance, or transportation, local disturbances can propagate beyond their origins. And by early 2020, the global system had exactly this character: high throughput, high connectivity, and limited capacity to absorb shocks. In 2013, Dirk Brockman and Dirk Helbing made this visible using global airline data. They showed that contagion spreads along an effective distance, not geography. Cities thousands of kilometers apart, maybe only one or two steps away. Epidemics follow these networks, not coastlines or borders. SARS-CoV-2 exposed this structure. Its rapid spread was not the failure of any single sector, not health, not transportation, not governance, but the behavior of a tightly coupled system in which local shocks travel quickly and widely. The lesson is not that globalization is inherently risky, but that certain forms of connectivity transform the risks that we face. In a world of dense mobility, stretched supply chains, and permeable ecological boundaries, the conditions for emergence and rapid dissemination are built into the architecture of modern life. To see how these structural features of connectivity intersect with disease, we need to be precise about what we mean first by pandemic. It's a word we think we understand, but its meaning sits at the intersection of language, epidemiology, and also politics. Etymologically, pandemic comes from the Greek pan and demos, the people. It's an affliction of all the people. Universality is built into the word, something crossing boundaries and disregarding distinctions. By contrast, epidemic means an illness upon the people, anchored in a particular community. Even here, scale and spatial extent are embedded in the vocabulary. But of course, etymology doesn't govern scientific usage. In epidemiology, we distinguish outbreaks, local and short-lived, epidemics, sustained transmission requiring public health response, and pandemics, multinational or continental spread with systemic disruption. In practice, however, these boundaries blur. When does an epidemic become a pandemic? How far must it spread, or whom must it affect before the world treats it differently? There is no strict consensus. The shift is partly epidemiological and partly interpretive, the moment when their problem becomes our problem. To formalize that moment, we create institutions. An important one is the World Health Organization, which defined a new bureaucratic term, the Public Health Emergency of International Concern, in 2005 in the revised International Health Regulations. A PHIC is an extraordinary event with international implications requiring coordinated response. It functions as an alarm bell, but also as a political act. Declarations move markets, close borders, and reshape diplomacy. They're rare, used only for H1N1, polio, Ebola twice, Zika, COVID-19, and Mpox twice. Each declaration balances evidence against consequence. Too early risks backlash, too late risks losing the window for containment. Consider SARS in 2003, fewer than 10,000 cases across 30 territories, small by pandemic standards, yet it transformed global health governance and directly shaped the modern IHR, the International Health Regulations. Was it an outbreak, an epidemic, a proto-pandemic? None of these labels fits neatly. The ambiguity reflects reality. Pandemics are not only biological phenomena, but also institutional and social ones. Calling something a pandemic does more than describe spread. It declares emergency, mobilizes resources, and activates legal authority. Naming is a form of power. It determines visibility, responsibility, and urgency. To understand pandemics, we should hold all three meanings together. Etymological, an affliction of all the people. Epidemiological, scale, distribution, sustained transmission. And institutional, the political and legal mechanisms that govern action. Together, these layers show that pandemics are not simply matters of contagion, but of connection. The boundary between epidemic and pandemic reflects not only viral dynamics, but our willingness to recognize interdependence. A pandemic is not just when a pathogen goes global, but when we can no longer pretend that we are not connected. Nearly every history of modern pandemics begins with the influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919. In spring of 18, an unusual influenza A, H1N1 virus, began circulating in US and military camps as the First World War reached its final phase. The first wave caused widespread illness, but relatively modest mortality. Over the summer and fall, the situation changed dramatically. Beginning in August, cities across North America, Europe, Asia, and Africa experienced a far more lethal second wave, followed by a third wave in early 19. And it continued activity into 1920. Although historical accounts often describe these waves as variants, the limited genetic material available from preserved lung tissues shows the virus remained broadly similar throughout. The heightened severity of the second wave likely reflects subtle viral changes, but also combined with wartime crowding, global troop movements, environmental conditions, and shifting population immunity. The virus's origin remains unresolved. Genomic analyses confirm that the pandemic strain contained avian-like gene segments, and that it later seeded both human and swine H1N1 lineages. Competing hypotheses place its emergence in North America or Europe, possibly involving swine or avian intermediaries, but no single scenario has been confirmed. Its impact was without precedent. Roughly 500 million people died, about a third of the world's population. About 500 million people, about a third of the world's population were infected, and 50 to 100 million died. In the United States, life expectancy plunged by 12 years in 1918, the largest single-year decline ever recorded. For our purposes, the 1918 pandemic is the benchmark for global infectious disease shocks. Extraordinary geographic reach, rapid transcontinental spread accelerated by wartime mobilization, multiple waves, and profound demographic and social disruption. It marks the moment when global interconnections, military, economic, and political, allowed a local virus to become a global catastrophe. Throughout the 20th and early 21st centuries, influenza dominated the pandemic landscape. Depending on how one counts, roughly half were caused by influenza A viruses. And this history has shaped our expectations. For decades, most preparedness planning, from WHO frameworks to national stockpiles, assumed that the next major pandemic would also be influenza. The focus was understandable but narrowing. It reflected the pathogens we had already encountered, rather than the broad ecological and social processes that generate emergence. COVID-19 made that limitation unmistakable. Pandemic risk is not confined to influenza, and our sense of the next big one has too often been guided by historical memory rather than by structural analysis. Not all influenza pandemics approach the severity of 1918, which remains an extraordinary outlier. Later events were far milder, reflecting differences in viral biology and improvements in clinical care, surveillance, and public health. The 1957 H2N2 arose in southern China through reassortment between an avian virus and the circulating human H1N1 strain, introducing new hemagglutinin, neuraminidase, and PB1 segments to the genome. It spread globally within months and caused an estimated 1 to 2 million deaths. Then in 1968, an H3N2 virus followed the same basic pattern, an avian-derived hemagglutinin replacing that on the circulating human virus. Because many people retain partial immunity, global mortality was closer then to only 1 million. The 2009 swine flu pandemic again emerged through reassortment, this time a mosaic of human, avian, and classical swine, as well as Eurasian swine lineages that had co-circulated in pigs for decades. Although it spread worldwide, its clinical severity was modest, with only 150,000 to 575,000 estimated deaths. Yet 2009 had an unexpected consequence. The new H1N1 strain displaced the previous H1N1 strain, and it also temporarily reduced the frequency of the more virulent seasonal H3N2 lineage in many reasons. Because H3N2 is associated with substantially higher per infection mortality, its ecological replacement likely reduced influenza deaths for a couple of years. In that sense, the 2009 pandemic may have actually saved lives by reshaping the viral landscape. So even within a single virus family, impact depends on when and where a strain lands, on the demographic, social, and infrastructural landscape it encounters. That's a clue to something deeper, which becomes clearer when we look beyond influenza to other pandemics. As COVID-19 reminded us, focusing on pathogens alone obscures the deeper forces that shape pandemic emergence. Novel agents arise from human and ecological systems and from the interfaces where those systems meet. Across the 11 major pandemics of the 20th and 21st centuries, 9 are closely tied to food, agriculture, or water. How humanity produces food, extracts resources, and organizes trade creates the ecological conditions in which pathogens evolve, spill over, and spread. Influenza makes this clearest. Most influenza pandemics begin with reassortment, the mixing of gene segments, when multiple influenza A viruses co-infect a host. Because influenza circulates widely in birds and mammals, opportunities for mixing are abundant in agriculture and mixed animal settings. The 1918 H1N1 virus carried avian-derived signatures, and the 57, 68, and 2009 pandemics all arose from reassortment in domestic animal systems. SARS 2002 and 2003 emerged from the wildlife-livestock-human interface in the live animal markets of southern China. Mass palm civets and raccoon dogs carried bat-derived coronaviruses, and roughly 40% of the earliest human cases had occupational exposure to wildlife handling. That's a pathway that involves the food economy. COVID-19 likely reflects a similar ecological structure. Viral diversity in bats, human contact via wildlife farming and trade, and spillover in a dense urban market. While a laboratory-associated origin cannot be entirely excluded, the strongest evidence supports zoonotic emergence through the wildlife trade. Cholera, the major non-viral pandemic, highlights a different but related system. The 7th pandemic, beginning in Indonesia in 1961, spread globally via maritime trade. Vibrio species, of which cholera is one, thrive in coastal waters and enter human populations through contaminated drinking water and seafood. Food, water, and commerce, again, form the substrate of emergence. Mpox provides yet another perspective. In Central Africa, many spillovers result from contact with rodents hunted or prepared for food. A 2003 US outbreak arose through a separate interface. Infected Gambian pouched rats, imported via the exotic pet trade, transmitted the virus to prairie dogs and then to humans. Across these examples, the pattern is consistent. Pandemics are not random biological events, but consequences of how societies produce food, structure trade, and interact with animals. Understanding emergence requires examining pathogens and the economic, ecological, and cultural systems that give rise to them. Another way to understand these pandemics is by examining how they spread. Nearly all modern pandemics have moved along the same global corridors that organize the world's economy. For respiratory pathogens such as influenza viruses and coronaviruses, international mobility acts as the accelerant. In 1918, influenza followed World War I troop and transport routes, reaching every inhabited continent within months. The 57, 68, and 2009 influenza pandemics spread in step with the rise of commercial aviation, each circling the globe in weeks. SARS in 02-03 and SARS-CoV-2 almost 2 decades later repeated the pattern. A local zoonotic emergence transformed into an international crisis through dense airline connectivity. Mobility and connectivity, core features of globalization, thus become part of the transmission ecology. But respiratory viruses are not the whole story. Trade and commerce also move pathogens, sometimes without moving infected people at all. The modern expansion of cholera, beginning in Indonesia and reaching Latin America decades later, followed shipping routes and ballast water discharge. The 2003 Mpox outbreak arose from trade in pets, agricultural commerce matters. The 2009 H1N1 virus emerged from swine populations shaped by decades of global live animal trade and reassortment between North American and Eurasian influenza lineages. Across these examples, the theme is consistent. Pandemic spread is structured, not random. The same networks that move people, goods, and animals through the global economy also channel the movement of pathogens. And not all pandemics begin in nature. A small but important subset of outbreak threats appear to have originated from laboratories. The clearest case is the 1977 so-called Russian flu. This H1N1 strain, nearly identical to viruses from the 1950s, reappeared almost simultaneously in the Soviet Union and northern China. Its genetic uniformity and lack of natural evolution strongly point to an accidental release, likely from a research or vaccine production facility. It was an early signal that as biomedical science has globalized, expanding virology capacity and circulating biological materials, laboratory risks could also become global. These concerns resurfaced during COVID-19. Most evidence still supports a zoonotic origin linked to wildlife and wildlife trade and farming, although a laboratory-associated accident cannot be completely excluded. Crucially, the policy lesson does not depend on the origin. Both SARS-CoV-2 and the 1977 H1N1 incident show that modern bioscience operates in a world where rare mistakes can have far-reaching consequences. As laboratory capacities grow worldwide and pathogen research becomes more international, the obligation to govern these activities safely and transparently grows as well. The frontier of biomedical progress is also a frontier of risk, and governance must keep pace with the science. Whether a virus first appears in a forest, a livestock system, a market, or a lab, what turns that appearance into a global crisis is the larger landscape that it enters. What we ultimately want to know is whether the modern pandemics we've reviewed here share genuine through lines. Pandemics are statistically scarce, however. A dozen major events in a century can suggest patterns, but hardly explain why new pathogens emerge. A better approach might be to view pandemics as the visible peaks of a much larger emergence landscape, several hundred documented emerging infectious events over recent decades. This raises a key question. Are pandemic-prone pathogens truly distinct, or simply the rare cases where particular biological traits intersect with particular social, ecological, economic, and political conditions? A topic I hope to return to later. For now, the important step is to widen the frame. Focusing only on pandemics, the outliers, obscures the deeper regularities found across all emerging infections, the background processes that determine when, where, and how new pathogens arise. This perspective anchors the foundational work I want to turn to next and is not new. For nearly 25 years, scholars have interpreted emerging infections as expressions of systemic, often human-driven change. Two early voices captured this clearly. Stephen Morse, a virologist at Rockefeller University and co-chair of an important 1992 Institute of Medicine committee, wrote in the inaugural issue of the CDC journal Emerging Infectious Diseases, most emerging infections appear to be caused by pathogens already present in the environment, given a selective advantage by changing conditions and afforded an opportunity to infect new host populations. Surprisingly often, Morse wrote, disease emergence is caused by human actions. A decade later, Deirdre Church, professor of pathology and laboratory medicine at the University of Calgary, echoed this in clinics and laboratory medicine. The pathogen-host interactions that contribute to the emergence of infectious diseases are linked to extraordinary complex change. Infectious diseases will remain a dominant feature of national and international public health efforts during this century. Both emphasized presciently that anthropogenic global change lies at the center of emergence, and it's from this vantage point that the modern study of emerging infectious diseases begins. The first major shift from qualitative insight to quantitative global analysis came with the 2008 Nature paper by Kate Jones and colleagues, the first systemic attempt to try and treat emerging infectious diseases as data rather than anecdotes. Jones and her team compiled more than 300 events from 1940 to 2004. Three patterns were especially striking. First, the temporal trend. Events rose steadily and peaked in the 1980s with a slight decline afterward. This doesn't mean spillover slowed. Rather, the late 20th century was a period of intense ecological and social disruption. Second, the biological pattern. Roughly 60 to 70% of emerging infections were zoonotic, meaning that they originated in animals. This aligns with the pandemic history we've just reviewed. Nearly all major pandemics of the past century have been zoonoses, with cholera as the exception. Third, the geographic pattern. Emergent regions undergoing rapid demographic growth, land use change, agricultural intensification, and growing economic activity. The contribution of the Jones study was conceptual as well as empirical. It showed that emerging infectious diseases constitute a measurable global process. They arise where human-driven ecological and societal changes accumulate, an early empirical bridge between emergence dynamics and the broader architecture of globalization. In recent years, some scholars have argued that preventing zoonotic spillover at its ecological source, especially by slowing tropical deforestation, could substantially reduce pandemic risk. Two influential policy essays by Dobson et al. In Science in 2020 and Vora et al. In Nature in 2022 synthesize extensive evidence linking forest loss, habitat fragmentation, road building, and wildlife trade to increased human-animal contact. These interfaces are especially important for bat-associated viruses such as Nipah, Ebola, and SARS-related coronaviruses. Both groups offer quantitative estimates. Dobson et al. Suggested annual investments of $20 to $30 billion in forest protection and wildlife trade regulation could be cost-effective, especially compared to COVID-19's vast economic toll. Vora et al. Urged that major global preparedness initiatives, G20, WHO, CBD frameworks, explicitly incorporate forest conservation. Together, these analyses reinforce a, quote, One Health perspective, connecting environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, climate change, and pandemic risk. But it is essential to situate this work within a broader causal landscape. Land use change is one pathway among many, and historically it has not triggered most major pandemics. Influenza pandemics emerged in agricultural, military, or urban settings. HIV spilled over through bushmeat, but became global through colonial labor systems and mobility. SARS-CoV-2, though linked to wildlife trade, was not driven by deforestation. And cholera spreads due to inadequate sanitation and global shipping. The point is not that deforestation is unimportant, it is, but the pandemic emergence reflects multiple interdependent systems: wildlife ecology, industrial agriculture, trade networks, urban density, mobility, and governance capacity. Reducing forest loss will lower the likelihood of some spillover events, especially bat-associated viruses, but would not have prevented most 20th or 21st century pandemics. Deforestation control is but one pillar of a broader prevention architecture. It addresses local spillover conditions, but pandemics arise when those local events intersect with global patterns of connectivity and vulnerability that allow a pathogen to move from a village to a region to the world. Two Institute of Medicine reports in 1992 and 2003 laid the groundwork for a systemic understanding of disease emergence, identifying it as a predictable outcome of human demographics, ecological disruption, global mobility, and other societal forces. By 2003, the framing had broadened to show these drivers as interdependent components of a rapidly changing global system, signaling an early shift toward a genuinely systemic theory of emergence. And as emerging disease research has moved from qualitative accounts to data-driven analysis, one insight has become clear. Emergence is shaped not by a few discrete causes, but by interactions among many. This comes into sharp focus in a recent comparative study I led at the Center for the Ecology of Infectious Diseases, analyzing the largest modern zoonotic outbreaks. The findings show not just a proliferation of associated factors, but a needed shift in how we understand causation. Traditional lists of drivers fail under empirical scrutiny. No single ecological, demographic, or behavioral factor consistently predicts outbreak size. Instead, emergence reflects combinatorial, multi-domain interactions that vary across events. In short, the closer we look, the more emergence reveals itself as a systemic, not linear phenomenon, a reframing that sets up the more detailed results to follow here. We analyzed the 100 largest modern zoonotic outbreaks, and what emerges is not simplicity, but structure. The deeper we look, the more multidimensional the landscape appears. Across these outbreaks, we identified 48 epidemiological, ecological, and socio-environmental characteristics, organized into 9 broad categories, including pathogen biology, host range, environmental context, transmission mode, vector ecology, and socioeconomic and political conditions. These traits do not form a single causal sequence. Instead, they create a many-to-many mapping. Each outbreak draws on a different subset of factors, and no single driver or small cluster consistently predicts the largest outbreak size. This is complexity in a strict sense. Emergence reflects combinatorial interactions across domains, not individualized pathways. Moreover, the temporal pattern mirrors Jones et al. Large zoonotic outbreaks increased through the 20th century, peaked in the 2000s, and then declined slightly, suggesting shared shifts in global conditions, enabling emergence and causing spread. To develop a systems-level explanation, we need then to borrow a concept from political economy and sociology. So I turn now to globalization. When we talk about globalization, we are describing far more than trade or technology. The concept has evolved over 4 decades, and that evolution matters for understanding its connection to emerging infectious diseases. The modern usage began in economics. In 1983, Theodore Levitt argued that new communication and production technologies were collapsing national differences in consumer markets. Globalization is planetary economic integration. By the early 1990s, this conception proved too narrow. Sociologist Anthony Giddens described globalization as the intensification of worldwide social relations, expanding the idea to institutions, culture, and everyday life. David Held and colleagues then formalized this multidimensional view in a very influential book in 1999 entitled Global Transformations, distinguishing economic, political, technological, and cultural forms of globalization, each unfolding on different spatial and temporal scales. Globalization is not a single trend, but an ensemble of interacting processes. Later, Barry Axford sharpened the vocabulary, distinguishing globalization, the processes linking distant places, globality, the degree of structural interconnection, and globalism, an ideology that celebrates that connection. And then most recently, Paulo Garbaudo's The Great Recoil argues that after decades of expansion, globalization now faces political backlash and ecological limits, emphasizing that globalization is historically contingent, not an inevitable endpoint. What unites these perspectives is a shared insight. Globalization concerns not just what moves across borders, but the architecture of relations that make such movement possible. Those architectures, economic, political, and cultural, define the environment in which new pathogens emerge and spread. Across these perspectives, globalization appears not as a single force, but as a shifting architecture of economic, political, and cultural relations binding distant places together. What matters for our purposes is that these architectures structure how people, goods, capital, and ideas move, and in doing so, shape the conditions under which new pathogens emerge and spread. To analyze the structure of this system, we need something more precise than the statement, "the world is globalized." We need a way to specify how interdependence is organized, by what mechanisms, along which pathways, and with which consequences. This is the purpose of what I call the globalization grid. The premise is simple. If globalization is the intensification of relations linking distant places, we can analyze it through the interactions between what moves, the means of globalization, and where it moves, the domains of globalization. The rows are global flows, goods, services, capital, people, ideas. The columns are the domains, economic, political, and cultural. At each cell of the grid is a moment of globalization, a concrete mechanism through which global integration operates. The grid reframes globalization not as a single trend, but as a system of flows whose interactions generate concrete effects on societies, environments, and health. Seen this way, pandemics arise not from isolated failures, but from the ordinary functioning of interconnected systems. Commerce reshapes ecological boundaries, capital drives new frontiers of extraction and contact, mobility moves pathogens along the same routes that move labor and opportunity, Intellectual property and fiscal regimes determine vaccine access, and ideas, whether scientific or conspiratorial, shape collective behavior. Pandemics become mirrors of globalization, biological events expressing economic, political, and cultural dynamics. And if globalization produces vulnerability, understanding its structure is the first step toward designing institutions capable of producing resilience. To see how the globalization grid materializes in real epidemics, consider Nipah virus, a pathogen that has never caused a pandemic, but repeatedly has seemed close. Its emergence in Malaysia in 1998, 1999, and its ongoing spillovers in Bangladesh and India show how economic change, ecological disruption, mobility, and cultural practice together create epidemic risk. Nipah virus is a Henipah virus maintained by Terapus bats. Flying foxes likely circulated long before its discovery. What changed in the 1990s was the landscape. Rapid economic growth, export agriculture, intensive pig production, and widespread deforestation compressed wildlife, livestock, and humans into novel configurations. Forest loss, intensified by the 1997-1998 El Niño, displaced those fruit bats and increased their reliance on cultivated orchards, many adjoining high-density pig farms. This produced an efficient spillover interface. Bats feeding on mangoes dropped contaminated fruit into pig enclosures. Pigs amplified the virus, and then farmers were exposed. Once the outbreak began in Perak, commercial traders moved thousands of live pigs south, unintentionally transporting Nipah to Negri Sembilan and to Singapore via pig imports. The agricultural supply chains that moved commodities now move pathogens. The Malaysian outbreak caused encephalitis with approximately 40% fatality and required culling over 1 million pigs, a vivid example of how economic interdependence magnifies biological shocks. After Malaysia, spillover shifted. Since 2001, Bangladesh and eastern India have experienced frequent Nipah outbreaks, sometimes with as much as 70% fatality. Here the main exposure route is different: consumption of raw date palm sap contaminated by bats, a culturally woven winter practice. Human-to-human transmission is substantial, with roughly 10% of cases generating secondary infections. Recent clusters in Kerala in 2018, 21, 23, 24, and 25 reflect further ecological and social change. Flying fox colonies near settlements repeatedly test positive for Nipah, and rapid land use transformation, deforestation, peri-urban population expansion, may be altering bat behavior and shedding patterns, paralleling ecological shifts also seen in Hendra virus. Across these settings, consistent elements recur. Land use change restructures bat ecology and elevates contact rates. Agricultural investment and trade create dense livestock populations and long supply chains. Cultural practices, such as pig husbandry and date palm sap harvesting, establish exposure pathways. And mobility, through livestock transport or movement of persons between hospitals, enables spread. These map directly onto those moments in the globalization grid: commerce and investment in Malaysia, consumption practices and mobility in Bangladesh, land use and health system strain in India. Nipah illustrates a general rule: emergence is rarely driven by a single mechanism. It arises from interacting economic, ecological, cultural, and infrastructural processes. The global spread of chikungunya virus in the 20th century follows its vector Aedes albopictus. Chikungunya causes acute fever and severe arthralgia. While most patients recover, up to 40% experience months or even years of persistent joint pain, giving chick one of the highest chronic burdens among arboviruses. Transmission occurs through Aedes mosquitoes, primarily two species, Aedes aegypti, and critically for global spread, Aedes albopictus. The worldwide expansion of albopictus over the past 4 decades is a textbook example of a biological invasion driven largely by international trade in used tires and ornamental plants, whose water-holding containers allow desiccation-resistant eggs to survive shipment. From Asia, the species has become established across Europe, the Americas, Africa, and parts of the Middle East. This expanding vector footprint set the stage then for a pivotal evolutionary shift. During a 2005-2006 epidemic in Reunion, chikungunya acquired the E1A226V mutation, enhancing transmission by albopictus. The result was an epidemic infecting roughly 1/3 of the island and seeding outbreaks throughout the Indian Ocean, India, Southeast Asia, Europe, and then ultimately the Americas from 2013 onward. Seen through the globalization grid, the Chick-V story illustrates how vector ecology, trade, mobility, and urbanization intersect. Goods and services, global trade and plant trade enabled the worldwide invasion of Aedes albopictus. Capital and investment, urbanization and containerized supply chains created abundant artificial breeding habitats. People, international travelers imported chikungunya into newly colonized regions, igniting local transmission. Ideas and cultural practices, consumer trade patterns, and urban design inadvertently expanded ecological niches for vectors. Chikungunya shows how emerging pathogens leverage global systems. Chick did not become a pandemic, but its trajectory demonstrates how patterned movements of organisms, goods, and people continually generate new opportunities for emergence. Lastly, the first global coronavirus epidemic of the 21st century, which was not COVID-19, but rather SARS in 2003. The earliest clusters appeared in Foshan and Guangzhou in late 2002 among food handlers exposed to wildlife in live animal markets. Investigations identified masked palm civets and raccoon dogs as intermediates and horseshoe bats as a reservoir. What turned this spillover into an international epidemic was the structure of commercial aviation. By 2003, airlines carried roughly 1.6 billion passengers annually, with dense hub and spoke routes across East Asia, Europe, and North America. Major cities were only a few flight segments apart, a topology that strongly shaped SARS dynamics. A pivotal event occurred on 21 February 2003, when an ill Guangdong physician spent one night on the 9th floor of the Metropole Hotel in Hong Kong. At least 16 other guests and visitors were infected. Several boarded flights the next morning to Hanoi, Singapore, and Toronto, seeding independent outbreaks within days. Much of SARS spread followed institutional vulnerabilities. Hospitals were major amplification sites, with healthcare workers comprising over 20% of cases. The Amoy Gardens outbreak exposed weaknesses in high-density urban housing. Faulty sewage and ventilation systems enabled aerosolized virus to spread to hundreds of residents. By July 2003, SARS caused 8,098 cases and 774 deaths across 29 countries. Though small compared with later pandemics, the economic impact, 30 to 40 billion US dollars, reflected global dependence on uninterrupted air travel, tourism, and business mobility. Containment succeeded through rapid isolation, contact tracing, and strict infection control, aided by key biological features, including limited pre-symptomatic transmission. Expert reviews afterward warned that a more transmissible coronavirus would be far harder to contain under contemporary mobility patterns. In hindsight, SARS was not merely a precursor to COVID-19, but a structural warning. It showed how the scale and connectivity of early 21st century aviation could carry a local zoonotic spillover across continents in days, the same architecture that later enabled the far faster global spread of SARS-CoV-2 on an even larger and more interconnected network. Having reviewed Nipah, chikungunya, and the 2003 SARS epidemic, we can now see the broader pattern that they reveal. Biologically, they differ. A bat-borne Nipah virus amplified in pigs, a mosquito-borne alpha virus spread by an invasive vector, and a coronavirus dispersed through hospitals and air travel. Yet mapped onto the globalization grid, a shared logic emerges. Each reflects a specific configuration of global flows, not an isolated ecological event. Nipah shows how economic globalization reshapes disease interfaces. Investment and agricultural expansion drove deforestation, plantation growth, and dense pig farming. Commerce moved infected pigs through national and cross-border supply chains. Here, economic flows reorganize ecologic contact. Chikungunya turns on goods, people, and vectors. Trade in used tires and ornamental plants dispersed Aedes albopictus globally. Travelers introduced chikungunya into regions where this invasive vector sustained transmission. This is globalization as biological transport infrastructure. And then SARS in 2003 highlights mobility and governance. A highly connected airline system carried infections from one hotel exposure to multiple countries within days. Information flows, delayed reporting, uneven surveillance, and evolving IHR mechanisms shaped spread and control. This is globalization as a stress test of mobility and institutions. Across these cases, no single driver dominates. Different cells of the grid activate in different combinations, reflecting interactions among ecological disruption economic integration, mobility, and institutional capacity. Emerging diseases are therefore not anomalies of nature, but predictable expressions of an interconnected global system. The key insight follows. Pandemics are not outliers, but the most visible manifestations of routine globalization processes. Situating outbreaks within the grid clarifies both their mechanisms and the structural vulnerabilities that make such events recur. Stepping back from Nipah, chikungunya, and SARS, the unifying features are not biological, but structural. 3 regularities characterize emergence in a globalized world. Coupling. These outbreaks begin where previously separate systems have become tightly linked. Bat ecology with industrial livestock, mosquito ecology with containerized shipping, wildlife trade with global aviation. Globalization multiplies and intensifies these interfaces, allowing disturbance in one domain to cascade to others. Second, acceleration. Connection is old, but the speed is new. Aedes albopictus eggs traverse oceans in used tire shipments. A single hotel exposure in Hong Kong seeds epidemics on 3 continents. Culturally rooted exposures, like date palm sap, now intersect with rapid environmental and economic change. Faster systems shrink the time available for detection and for intervention. Last, asymmetry. Risk is unevenly distributed. The forces that create emergence differ from those that shape vulnerability or response. Nipah spillover occurs despite strong health systems. SARS reached Toronto despite wealth. Chikungunya spread wherever competent vectors were established regardless of income. Exposure is shared, consequences unequal. Together, coupling, acceleration, and asymmetry form a structural signature of 21st century epidemics, system-level expressions of how the modern world is organized. These regularities raise deeper questions. First, from drivers to configuration. The IOM reports, Jones et al. And Stevens et al. List many drivers: land use change, mobility, demography, governance, the list goes on. But in Nipah, chikungunya, and SARS, no single factor explains emergence. What matters is the configuration, how ecological disruption, trade, travel, and information interact in specific contexts. The analytic unit is the pattern, not the driver. Second, matching governance to system structure. Here I offer, cautiously, an analogy to the mathematics of fractals. Mathematically, fractals show similar structure at different scales. Pandemic risk is maybe not literally fractal, but coordination problems recur locally, nationally, and globally. Local systems detect and contain. National governments regulate land use and mobility. International bodies coordinate information and collective action. The same patterns of coupling and failure appear at each level. Effective governance must mirror this self-similarity, multiple nested layers that reinforce each other rather than a single global solution. A world resilient to pandemics is too precious and their capabilities too limited for us to rely solely on major bodies such as the US CDC and World Health Organization. Pandemic preparedness must occur at all scales. Third, a focus on leverage points. If emergence is a systems property, the most effective interventions target the infrastructures globalization runs on: mobilization networks, land use regimes, supply chains, and information flows that shape trust and response. Small, well-designed changes in these nodes can alter the configurations that let local spillovers scale into global crises. The shift then is from counting drivers to understanding and governing the recurrent structures in which those drivers combine. What I want to leave you with is not a prediction, but a reframing. We've moved from spillover biology to mobility, from ecological disruption to the political economy of global integration. The core message is straightforward. Pandemics are not anomalies. They're system-level expressions of the interconnected world that we have built. The shadow metaphor is intentional. A shadow is not an accident. It is a structural consequence of form. In a world organized around dense mobility, extended supply chains, and rapid capital flows, rapid pathogen emergence and spread are not surprises. They are properties of the system itself. The policy question is therefore not whether globalization can or should be reversed. It cannot, and in many ways it cannot. The real task is to redesign global interdependence so that the same forces that have resulted in vulnerability instead generate resilience. That means that governance systems aligned with the risks that they manage, institutions that detect weak signals early and act before cascades form, sectors such as finance, agriculture, and trade that integrate ecological and epidemiologic intelligence rather than externalizing it, and multi-layered coordination across local, national, and international scales. Pandemic preparedness is often treated as a technical supplement, surveillance, stockpiles, vaccines. But in a world where everything moves, preparedness is an architectural principle, aligning governance with the scale, speed, and coupling of modern interdependence. If pandemics are the shadow cast by globalization, then resilience depends on reshaping the form that casts it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, John. Really brilliant talk, and looking forward to hear more from you. So now we will have questions and answers. John, please. And I'm sure there will be lots of questions. The first one here.
Thank you very much. That was really fascinating and all-encompassing. Can I ask you a question? It's got political dimensions. Do you have any opinions on what's happening because of the Trump administration in the US and how that might affect the work of people like you who are trying to presumably prevent global pandemics in the future?
So the question asks whether or not the actions of the Trump administration are affecting our global preparedness, and certainly they are. For instance, withdrawal from the World Health Organization, the removal of USAID, and so forth, I think are quite dramatic. Whether in the long term those are actually the factors that will undermine our global preparedness or not, I'm not sure. The optimistic part of me hopes that what will happen as a result is the emergence of ideas, actions at many scales, scales which are not particularly the responsibility of the federal US government in response. I do think that part of our historical response, its fragility, has to do with the fact that we have particularly concentrated responsibility for disease outbreaks in a small number of institutions and organizations. And so I think that the diffusion of that responsibility, which is likely an inevitable outcome of what are understandably disastrous policies, is potentially a silver lining.
Thank you for your talk. I have two questions. You clearly said in your talk that mobility and air travel acted as a driver for the spread of SARS-CoV-2. But throughout this period, even in 2021, the worst year of the pandemic, the WHO maintained the stand that air travel should not be banned or even restricted. What is your comment on this? My second question is about the origin of SARS-CoV-2. We still don't know anything clearly about the origin of this virus, despite many attempts of WHO, independent scientists, and several other agencies. Do you think that we failed somewhere, and why, to understand the origin, and if it would impact our response to the next pandemic?
So thank you for those questions. I'll take them in order. So concerning the use of travel restrictions to contain pandemics, many studies suggest that it is unlikely that most pandemics can be contained by severe restrictions of travel. I think that travel restrictions are probably most effective only for a short period of time in order to buy time to develop more proactive response. There may be some limited cases where they may be effective, but the costs are tremendous. And I think one of the lessons that we learned from the West Africa Ebola epidemic is that by limiting the movement of people and material, we also limit the ability to provide aid in a response. So I think travel restrictions should only be used very carefully. That said, the fact that many of our pathogens circulate in this global interconnected network actually offers opportunities for surveillance. So for instance, some groups are pioneering the use of wastewater surveillance, so detecting excreted pathogens in wastewater, human waste that's collected on airplanes as a way of identifying the flows of pathogens around the world. Similarly, viruses can be detected on ventilation filters. I think these are probably wise investments for understanding pathogen spread and being able to respond to it quickly. In terms of the origins of SARS-CoV-2, I think that this is deeply murky and absent some very clear, compelling case likely to remain that way for the foreseeable future. If such information does exist, there are vested interests in keeping it cloudy. Would we have responded differently had we known its origin? I think not. So in terms of response, it's probably not particularly relevant. In terms of risk factors, I think it is relevant because I do remain concerned that inadequate biosecurity is one of our global vulnerabilities for emerging diseases, both of humans and of livestock.
Thank you. There was a hand there at the back.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I suppose a lot of those case studies rely on viewing globalization through the framework of moving people and livestock, so physical movement. I wonder if it's worth looking at globalization more from the framework of information transfer and globalization of communication, and whether it's worth looking at that almost as an inhibitor, not necessarily of the emergence of pandemics, but of the spread of pandemics. I mean, for example, with SARS-CoV-2, we had the transfer of the genome very, very quickly around the world. And for ongoing outbreaks of filoviruses in Africa, those are identified very, very quickly. Information about them is shared very, very quickly, and resources can be directed very, very quickly. So I wonder, is it worth looking at globalization potentially as a positive thing in those lights, as well as a negative thing?
Absolutely it is. So I think you are very sympathetic with my project. So the foil for this work is that I think for some of us, there has been too long this sort of deterministic, almost fatalist perspective. Diseases will spill over in different places for whatever reason, and we can't prevent that. There is a global connectivity network, and that seems unmovable, and these diseases will propagate at certain rates given by contact patterns which are innate to human behavior and the virology of the pathogen. I don't think that's true. I think that all of these things are manifestations of social phenomena just as much as they are biological phenomena, and that's what I want to draw attention to. Of course, the exchange of information and ideas is a key part of that. And that's true whether it's the exchange of information about the genetic sequence of the virus, the production methods for a vaccine, or the exchange of information about attitudes toward vaccination or non-pharmaceutical interventions. So I think just as we have the opportunity in the structural systems that we've created to prevent the spread, we have the opportunity but also the risk in the social systems that we've created to prevent or produce the spread of emerging diseases.
Thank you, and thank you for a fascinating way of weaving together so many different elements that enable us to understand better how to actually respond. You used a wonderful term, or fascinating term at the end. Preparedness is more to do with architecture, I think was how you framed it. Could you comment for a moment, what explains then, just a few years after perhaps the most consequential pandemic in living memory, that the world is actually, if anything, walking away from a greater degree of investing in that architecture and in its capacity to be prepared? And maybe also to make a link to what you touched on just now, how could what you have presented today become a more integral way of interpreting also the risks to national security, which are so dominant in the political discourse today? Thank you.
I think those are wonderful questions. So the first question had to do with the fact that to many of us it seems we are even less prepared now than we were 5 years ago before a disastrous pandemic. I don't have a comprehensive answer to that question, but I'll point to two things. So one is, in my very brief history of the concept of globalization, I remarked that in the 1980s and 1990s, many scholars and observers thought that globalization was an inevitable process. And with the rise of populist movements, nationalist movements, and polarization in global society, we've seen some fracturing of those global interconnections. I think understanding some of that and understanding the loss of trust in major organizations, whether they be governmental or non-governmental, would be a place to start. I'll also point to an historical episode which concerns the 1918 influenza pandemic. There was an almost collective amnesia about the dramatic effects of the 1918 influenza, so that for 2 generations it was hardly discussed. To some extent it was in a very rarefied technical epidemiologic literature, but until the 1970s it was actually not part of our general history of the pre-war period. And so I think whatever is the collective trauma that we experienced in COVID-19 has been experienced in the past, and understanding that may be very important. Your second question has to do with national security. I do think that the emergence of novel infections is important to national security. I don't think it is the only or perhaps primary threat to national security. I will note that the US government for a number of years issued an annual report on national security threats. And it was interesting to me, and I have a slide, not with me today, where I look at the threats that they report in, it's kind of a figure that's a rubric, and it has to do with how likely they are and how severe they are. Now, I'm an ecologist by training, and it was interesting to me that in the upper right-hand corner of that figure, the US government thought that all of the key threats, national security threats, were in fact environmental. They had to do with things like global climate change. But one. And that one was pandemics. But when I look at pandemics, I see that as an environmental threat as well. Sadly, this year that report is being discontinued.
So I'm interested in the phenomenon of when you have an extreme crisis, although it may be caused by globalization, there can often be a withdrawal to the nation state as where a lot of the resources to respond come from and where the blame lies for when things go wrong. And actually the international networks, yes, you've got sort of supply chains, but they were very disrupted. You have international agreements like the pandemic agreement, which has improved our preparedness in some ways, but it's really rather limited. It's not redistributing PPE stocks, for example. So how do how can we better collaborate internationally with preparedness in terms of, agreeing joint objectives and capitalizing on connections with other countries? Should we have sort of coalitions of the willing where countries are doing more together, or is that just not really possible?
So I think the question says, how should we sort of organize our societies in order to be more resilient? And you offered one option, which is international coalitions, a coalition of the willing. I think we need to vastly increase our list of possible responses. So that is definitely one. And I think any coalition must start with the willing, but I do not think that it can be top-down. So for instance, for me, one of the most interesting insights that came out of the COVID-19 pandemic was the huge challenge for international and even federal national organizations to respond comprehensively, limited by their narrow regulatory scope typically. But the vast action space of many large actors, whether these are non-governmental relief organizations, whether they're large companies, whether they're major municipalities or cities. And I think that many of these organizations could develop better planning and coordination. As intellectuals, I think our role is to come along and suggest opportunities for doing that, and broadly speaking, to outline the structures that have caused us to get into such a fragile state in the first place, as well as to explore what different opportunities there are for creating a more resilient world, hopefully without too great disruption to all of the benefits that we enjoy from globalization, such as economic efficiency.
We may have time for a very, very fast question if somebody has any. No, that's great. Christoph, very, very last minute.
Yeah, thanks, John. When comparing how different countries responded to COVID, there were also sociological differences. So countries that did particularly well seem to be characterized by people trusting each other, which seems to underpin being able to act cooperatively. That seems to be a difficult thing to engineer, and I was wondering where it fits into your grid and ways forward. Thanks.
I think you're right that trust, and not just trust, but other psychosocial attributes of shared life together, is actually really key. Probably both to preventing spillover in the first place, for instance, between the sectors that are exposed to risk and the larger forces that, for instance, generate business, as well as in our responses to it. I think understanding the underlying determinants of trust, as well as other attitudes toward, for instance, a willingness to work together, a willingness to share costs, a willingness to take costs on oneself for the general good, is something that is deeply more important for us to study here. In my own work, I've become interested in the social psychology of vaccines. This is not a new topic, but to me, what is new about it is trying to understand that in a way that can be related to sort of the variation between societies and between groups within societies, so that we can better understand the networks on which respiratory infections travel. I think that our science in this space is in its very infancy, and there's a great deal of work to do. For myself, some of what I've found most interesting, most enlightening, most exciting over the past 5 years has been my interactions with social scientists exactly on these topics.
Thanks a lot, John, for a wonderful talk and wonderful discussion. Thanks to you for your questions. And just before you leave, so in December, there will be a PSI seminar on the 3rd of December. It will be in the Institute of Developmental and Regenerative Medicine. Changing topic, this time will be about vaccine and early censure with Bassam Alice from UKHSA. So you are all welcome to join, of course. And for now, thanks again, John, and thanks to you.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun.